the fantasy football season, and here's a few quarterbacks I would bench this week. The first guy, Jalen Hurts of the Philadelphia Eagles. So it's been a pretty good fantasy season for Jalen Hurts this year. But as far as real life, it's not been that good for the Philadelphia Eagles, who are 3-6 on the season. So Hurts here this season, he's passed 20 or more fantasy points the first 7 out of 9 fantasy days this season. But right here, the last 2 weeks, the numbers have been mediocre for Jalen Hurts. Week 8 at Detroit, 103 passing yards and 71 yards rushing. And Week 9 versus the Los Angeles Chargers, 162 passing yards, a touchdown, and 62 yards rushing. So right now, he's not getting as many goal line touchdowns like he was early in the season. They got Jordan Howard back there, running back, and he's, believe it or not, taking a lot of those goal line stampers is Howard. And this week, another tough matchup on paper here for the Philadelphia Eagles at the Denver Broncos that give up the second least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. We saw last week them pretty much shut down Dak Prescott and the Dallas Cowboys until garbage time in that ball game. So right here, Jalen Hurts, once again, I think it's another struggling game for him where he's under 20 fantasy points, and he's a quarterback I would bench this week if you got better options. The next quarterback I would bench this week is Carr of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Carr, he's been up and down this season. And the last couple weeks, he had some good games. And then last week in Week 9, it was a total bust ball game for Carr, where I thought he would have a better ball game. But he only finished with 296, a touchdown, 2 windows, a fumble loss in that one. Week 10, I know he's got a good matchup versus the Kansas City Chiefs that give up the third most fantasy points to quarterbacks. But for some reason this week, I see this Chief defense locking in once again like they did like Jordan Love and this Packer offense in Week 9. And right here, just don't see a big game for Carr for whatever reason in this one. I know it's prime time. I know it's Sunday Night Football, but I think Carr in this one has a mediocre ball game once again, anywhere from 15 to 18 fantasy points. And that's pretty much about it. So I will bench him this week. And the third and final quarterback I will bench this week's Baker Mayfield. Browns. So the Browns here, obviously a big victory last week in that ball game for Cleveland, where they destroyed the Cincinnati Bengals 41-16, but Baker still didn't have a huge game in that one. 218 passing yards and 2 touchdowns. And right here, another tough matchup for him on paper at the New England Patriots that give up the third least amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks. So Baker this season, he really hasn't had those big games. Only one game of 20 or more fantasy points, and that was Week 5 at the Chargers. So right here, I know Nick Chubb's most likely out because of the COVID list, but I see a lot of Dearness Johnson in this one, and a lot of ground and pound and a tight ball game between these two teams, where I could also see it being a low-scoring type of matchup. So Baker here, he's not having the big games. He's a mediocre quarterback for fantasy circles, where maybe 200, 250 yards and maybe 2 touchdowns in this one. But whether better quarterbacks off by this week, and Baker's struggling this season, I think he's an easy quarterback to get away from and bench. So that's a few quarterbacks I would bench here in Week 10 of the fantasy football season.